Hey there, I'm Leo Tolstoy, and welcome to Genius Stories. First, a huge thanks to the Genius Stories team for giving me this chance to bring one of my works to life. Today, the team is bringing you one of my fictional political satires, and trust me, this one is going to be interesting. The story is called Too Dear, and it takes place in the little kingdom of Monaco, where something very unusual happened. The Genius Stories team will guide you through everything that happened, so stick around until the end, because I'll be back to share the moral and what this story really means. All right, let's dive into the story.
On the sunny shores of the Mediterranean Sea, between France and Italy, there lies a kingdom so tiny that even a small town in the countryside might have more people living in it. This little kingdom is called Monaco, and it has only about 7,000 people in all. But even though Monaco is so small, it has everything that a real kingdom should have. A prince who lives in a fine palace, ministers to advise him, generals to command his army, and an army of 60 men. Yes, only 60. But that is enough for such a small place. The prince collects taxes on wine, tobacco, and even a small poll tax from each person. But because there are very few people, the amount collected is very small. With such little income, the prince would have struggled to pay his ministers, generals, and servants in the palace. So, the prince found another way to earn money. He opened a gambling house. Here, people came to play games of chance like roulette. Some people won, many lost, but the prince always got a share of the money, which gave him enough to live like a king. Now, in the old days, many of the small German rulers also had gambling houses of their own. But these were stopped by the government because they caused great harm. People would come to gamble, lose all their money, and then borrow money that did not belong to them, and lose that too. When everything was gone, they were so miserable that some of them drowned themselves or shot themselves in despair. Because of this, the Germans ordered their rulers to shut down the gaming houses and never make money by such a cruel method again. But there was no one to stop the Prince of Monaco. He remained the only ruler in Europe with a monopoly, the only one who still allowed gambling. And so, all the gamblers from other countries began to come to Monaco. They tried their luck at the tables, and whether they won or lost, the prince always earned money. Thanks to this, the prince was able to have his coronation, hold meetings with his people, reward or punish them like other kings do, and live in his palace with dignity, all supported by the money that came from gambling, wine, and tobacco. Everything was peaceful until one day a murder shocked the quiet little kingdom. One day, something most unusual happened in this quiet little kingdom. A murder was committed. The people of Monaco were peaceful, and such crimes were rare, so this became a big event. The judges, prosecutors, lawyers, and jury were all called together with great ceremony. They carefully listened to the case, debated, and finally decided that the murderer must be put to death. The judgment was written and sent to the prince. The prince read it and said, "If he must be executed, then let it be done." But there was a serious problem. Monaco had no guillotine, the machine used to cut off a criminal's head, and no executioner to carry out the punishment. The ministers quickly wrote to the government of France, asking them to lend Monaco a guillotine and an expert to do the work. France replied politely, saying they could send both, but it would cost 16,000 francs. When the prince heard this, he was shocked. 16,000 francs for one man? That is too much. The criminal is not worth so much money. If we spend this, we will have to raise everyone's taxes by 2 francs, and the people will complain and may even riot. Is there no cheaper way to do it? So the ministers gathered again for a council meeting. This time, they wrote to the King of Italy, thinking perhaps he would charge less. The reply came back that Italy would indeed send the machine and executioner for 12,000 francs, which was cheaper but still far too expensive. Once again, the prince called his ministers and asked them to think of another way. "Perhaps we can do it ourselves," one suggested. The general was called and asked if one of his 60 soldiers could cut off the man's head. After all, soldiers are trained to kill in war. The general spoke to his men, but none of them was willing. "No," they said, "we have never been taught to do such a thing. We don't know how." So, after thinking long and hard, the ministers decided to change the punishment. Instead of executing the man, they would sentence him to imprisonment for life. This would allow the prince to show mercy, and it would also be cheaper than paying thousands of francs for an execution. When no one agreed to cut off the criminal's head, the prince's ministers finally decided to change the punishment. Instead of death, the man would spend his entire life in prison. But there was one problem. Monaco had never needed a real prison before. There was only a small lockup for drunkards or petty thieves, nothing strong enough to keep a man for life. So the prince ordered a proper little prison to be prepared. A guard was placed at the door, and food was sent from the palace kitchen every day. At first, everyone was satisfied. The murderer was safely locked up, the prince had shown mercy, and justice had been done. But after 1 year, the prince sat down to check his accounts. That is when he noticed something shocking. The cost of keeping this one man was over 600 francs a year. 600 francs. Just to keep a single criminal. There was the guard's salary, his food, the prisoner's food, and other small expenses. And worst of all, the prisoner was young and healthy. He could easily live another 50 years. When the ministers calculated the total, they were alarmed. If he lived 50 more years, Monaco would spend 30,000 francs on him, just for doing nothing. "This will never do," said the prince. He called his ministers and told them, "You must find a cheaper way of dealing with this rascal. The present plan is too expensive." So the ministers held long discussions, formed committees, and argued for hours. Finally, one of them said, "The guard is costing us too much. Let us dismiss him." Another minister objected, "But if there is no guard, the man will escape." "Let him escape," said the first, "and be hanged to him." So they dismissed the guard and waited to see what would happen. To their surprise, nothing happened. The prisoner stayed inside the prison as if nothing had changed. Every day he came out at the right time, went to the palace kitchen, collected his food, returned to his cell, shut the door behind him, and calmly ate. He never tried to run away. When the ministers saw that the prisoner refused to run away, they were puzzled. They called him and said, "Why don't you leave? There is no guard. You are free to go wherever you want." But the man shook his head and calmly replied, "Go where? You have ruined my life and my name. People will never accept me. I have got used to living like this, without work, without worry. First you sentenced me to death and did not carry it out. Then you sentenced me to prison for life, and now you expect me to leave? No, I will not go. Do what you like. I am staying here." This answer put the ministers in even greater trouble. The man had no wish to escape, yet the kingdom could not afford to keep feeding him forever. They held more meetings, more discussions, and again considered the accounts. At last, one clever minister said, "Gentlemen, we cannot keep him in prison, but he refuses to go unless we take care of him. The only solution is to pay him to leave. Give him a pension. It will still cost us money, but much less than keeping him for life." The prince agreed. A yearly pension of 600 francs was fixed, and 1/3 was paid to him in advance. When the prisoner heard this offer, he smiled and said, "Very well. As long as you pay me regularly, I will leave." And so he walked out of the prison, not as an escaped criminal, but as a man living on a royal pension. He went across the border to a small town just 15 minutes away by train. There, he bought a bit of land, became a market gardener, and started a peaceful new life. Every year, he comes back at the proper time to collect his pension, sometimes spends a little at the gambling tables, and then goes back home. Thus, the murderer of Monaco lived happily ever after, not in prison, not dead, but enjoying a quiet, comfortable life paid for by the prince.
And that, my friends, was my story. Too dear. The moral of the story is simple yet powerful. Justice should be thoughtful, practical, and humane. The little kingdom of Monaco learned that punishing the man was costing them far more than the crime itself. This reminds us that solutions must be wise, cost-effective, and focused on the good of society rather than blindly following tradition. Before we end, let me test you. I have one question for you. How much did Italy charge Monaco for sending the guillotine machine and the executioner? Write your answer in the comment box below. Let's see how many of you were paying attention. Finally, I want to thank Genius Stories for giving me the opportunity to share this tale with you. If you enjoyed this story, support them by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to the channel so that more such meaningful stories can be brought to life. All right, my friends, until next time, goodbye.